Are the Dallas Cowboys changing their tune on how to handle the offseason? We'll debate on this episode of the Locked On Cowboys podcast.
You are Locked On Cowboys, your daily Dallas Cowboys podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome back to the Locked On Cowboys podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. We'd like to thank you for making us your first listen of the day. I am your host, Marcus Mosher. You can follow me on Twitter at Marcus_Mosher. Joining me today, as always, is Landon McCool. You can follow him on Twitter at McCoolBCB. And Landon, we got to discuss some news that came out over the last 2 days about the Cowboys. We had Stephen Jones talking to a couple of media members at the NFL Combine. We had a piece by David Moore that came out at the Dallas Morning News. I believe it was Monday morning about some of the plans for the Cowboys this offseason. So just generally, do you think the Cowboys are maybe changing their philosophy on how to change or how to approach the offseason?
Well, I will say that they are at least saying that they are, right? And I know that, you know, just based on a casual peruse of social media, that isn't necessarily convincing very many folks. It seems like the memes are still flying fast and furious, and lots of mockery. But I think, you know, we should probably take the moment to recognize the fact that saying that they're going to do something this offseason and saying that, you know, and especially with the kind of tone that they're using and the words that they're using, I think that does actually constitute a change, right? A little bit in the way that they're kind of approaching things. I mean, I went back and actually listened to Steven almost a year ago today at his kind of pre-combine, you know, meeting with the media and the conversation. First of all, it's a little depressing to go do that because part of that conversation was, well, man, when is Overshone and Diggs going to be back from their ACL injuries? And I'm like,
were you watching the wrong video?
Yeah, I had to double check several times. And so you know, but the other thing that was interesting to me is, you know, you hear him talk about Tony Pollard, right? And Tyron Smith, two guys that obviously the Cowboys didn't re-sign, right? And the way that it's funny, they use a little bit of the same idioms, right? Like we'll wait and see, right? But the difference is that when he spoke about Pollard and Tyron Smith, he gave like this long, almost kind of a eulogy over the two players, you know, careers of the Cowboys. And then at the end was like, we'll wait and see. I think the real difference here is, and first of all, we'll talk about the lead in the David Moore article, which I think, you know, if the Cowboys didn't write it themselves, I mean, I don't know who did.
Yeah.
But I think that the way that you hear him talk about, hey, we've already engaged with Osa's agents, right? We really want to have him come back. We'll see how the money works out, but we're already it actually, the way he phrased it, the we'll see in this one is we'll see how this week goes. So he actually gave you kind of a timeline as to when things may be developing. So I know it's a lot of words, and I have been the person that's been here saying, don't listen to his words, listen to his feet, watch his feet. But I do think it's worth at least mentioning, not trusting yet, but at least mentioning that the words are different. So maybe that means that we'll see different actions this offseason as well.
Generally, what the Cowboys say in the offseason when it comes to signings, trades, drafts is what they end up doing. Go watch like their pre-draft pressers. They basically tell you exactly what the plan is in the draft before the draft happens. Now, we'll talk about the all-in comments in a second when we get to segment 2, but they do outline what's going to happen. And the conversation with Osa, where it's pretty clear the Cowboys want to bring back Osa Odigizua, reminds me of a couple of years ago when DeMarcus Lawrence was scheduled to hit free agency going into the Combine. And the Cowboys, Stephen Jones literally said the exact thing. Hey, we'll see how this week goes. We'd love to have him back. We want him back. And of course, they got him to come back. So I think it's pretty clear that they do want to go out and retain Osa. I think they want to re-sign a couple of the other guys. But one of the things in that David Moore article that you didn't mention was no Chauncey Golston. It doesn't seem like they have plans to bring Chauncey Golston back, a couple other free agents, but it sounds like they do plan on trying to get some of these things done sooner rather than later.
Yeah, I mean, look, let me just read the quick lead of this article just to show you how much it was. At least I think trying to convince Cowboys fans that things may be different this year, right? The Cowboys have begun negotiations with free agent defensive tackle Osa Odigizua. Talks of extension for Micah Parsons will follow. Club officials hope to retain free agents Jordan Lewis and Rico Dowdle while getting a feel for veteran defensive end DeMarcus Lawrence. And to continue his career. And outside free agents, question mark? The Cowboys intend to be more aggressive on that front this
We'll get to that.
I mean, they listed. I mean, they listed five guys that they plan on getting contracts worked and or at least talking to, right? And then obviously hitting the topic of being more aggressive in free agent. We'll talk about that a little bit more in the next segment. But I think it's very clear to me that at the very least, the Cowboys are, making a media push to convince folks that they are actually kind of, changing their off-season approach, at least versus last year, right? And we'll see how that all plays out. But the fact that they kind of came out, like you said, specifically named 4 or 5 guys, and obviously specifically didn't name guys like Golston, who maybe they just realize is probably going to price himself out of what they want. So I do think that the fact that they are, implying and not hemming and hawing a little bit like they normally do when they aren't going to re-sign folks, I think it's a good sign that maybe these guys are going to actually get a good push to try to bring them back.
And the last thing I want to say here is I watched the interview with Stephen Jones talking to, I think it was John Machota, I believe. And there was a couple other reporters there. You can tell by just watching that clip that things are a little bit different. I think Stephen Jones has heard some of the outside noise.
Yeah,
and sure. I think they know they can't continue to just be a draft and develop team. They have to go out and be aggressive. They have to go out and try to get some of these contracts done. They can't afford to have another offseason where they have an exodus of talent. And I think that's why you are seeing not a complete change in philosophy, but enough to where it's going to look different compared to what we've seen over the last couple of years.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not expecting them to go out and spend, tens and tens and tens of millions of dollars in unrestricted free agency, but
no,
I am expecting them to make enough of a change to kind of prove the point that they aren't who they're being portrayed in the media. I think, which if it took this to kind of push them away from that, then that's great. Whatever gets them to behave like a more appropriate NFL franchise, I'm for.
Let's talk about the potential of this team being more aggressive in free agency, because that is something that Stephen Jones and David Moore from Dallas Morning News mentioned. We will get to that next. Welcome back to the Locked On Cowboys podcast. We'd like to thank you for making us your first listen of the day. We are discussing the Cowboys' change in tune, maybe when it comes to their philosophy of approaching the offseason. Let's talk about free agency. The new catchphrase for the Cowboys this year is selectively aggressive in free agency. So before I give my thoughts, I want your thoughts. What do you think Stephen Jones meant by that?
I mean, I think that it meant that they were going to go after a couple bigger fish than they probably would normally, but that they're not going to be going, absolutely bonkers. I think he was trying to set the expectation of, yeah, we're going to do more in acquiring talent outside of the walls of the star. But I don't know that by the selective aspect of it obviously is a hedge, right? Like they're not trying to imply that they're going to go out and, get 4 $10+ million a year contracts added to their books this offseason. I think it's more likely that maybe they go land one big outside free agent, which that's more aggressive than they're used to, and certainly would be selective, right? And I think the selective is probably more just like when I heard that part, to me that's more like just being more precise with who you're spending the money on, as opposed to I want to go out and spend $15 million on a guard or whatever. Like I think it's more just like the right person we're willing to spend big money for, but we're not just going out and have a budget to spend on a guard or a potential other free agent starter that we want to bring in.
And that was my exact takeaway. I think they're still going to sign probably 8 to 10 1-year vet minimum deals or maybe slightly above vet minimum to kind of build the middle of this roster. But I wouldn't be surprised if they've highlighted 2 or 3 unrestricted free agents that they would be willing to pay market value for. Now, the question is, what positions are that? Could they be targeting? And who are the names in that group? And what would they be willing to spend? But to me, that's what my takeaway was. That it's that I think they are going to look at 2 to 3 players, specific players, and go after them.
And I would throw in too, because we have basically kind of been implying that it's unrestricted free agency that they would be looking at. They specifically mentioned trades too.
Yeah,
as a way of player acquisition. They went out of their way to mention it. So I wouldn't be shocked if maybe the selective aggression has to do with maybe making a trade of someone that becomes available that they really like in a position of need. So look out for those as well.
Let's speculate.
Okay.
I don't want to necessarily say players because it's a little hard when we still have a couple weeks until free agency. We're not even quite sure who's going to be available. But if you were looking at the roster today and looking kind of at what the draft is going to hold in the next 2 months, which positions do you think they might target in free agency?
Well, let's take them at their word for at least for now, right? Let's say that they go out, they re-sign Osa to some deal, right? Congratulations, we're all thrilled about it. Jordan Lewis comes back. Maybe you bring back Rico Dowdle on a $4 or $5-6 million a year deal, right?
Mm-hmm.
I think wide receiver does make some sense, right? I think that the market isn't like absolutely, bountiful with the kind of guys that you want, but I think there is something to the idea of, hey, what's Stefan Diggs got left? His brother's still here. They've made it clear that they would like to play together.
They can rehab their bad knees together.
They can rehab their bad knees together. I mean, how worried are we about the knee? Like, can he come? Do we think he can come back? I think his game is such that even with coming back off an ACL, I still think he would be a valuable receiver. The question becomes about money, because I don't think that the Cowboys are necessarily in the market for like the T. Higgins, right? Who's going to probably get 25 million plus easy, right?
I think 35 is more appropriate.
Well, there you go.
Go ahead.
So yeah, I do think that it is going to be kind of more of that second or third tier wide receiver, which is still a tier or two above where they're usually shopping. So I think wide receiver makes some sense, just because I think that that's a position that if you don't get in free agency or through a trade, you're probably going to need to target early in the draft just to kind of get someone that would actually move the needle a little bit. If there was another defensive tackle that like paired well with those, I wouldn't be shocked if they went that route.
Let's run through some of the receivers just really quickly. This is using Pro Football Focus's updated free agency rankings and projected contracts. You just say yes, no, or you can expand. Amari Cooper, 2 years, $30 million.
No, I mean, for me, no. I especially since you want somebody who's going to be a solid blocker, especially if you're going to be paying $15 million a year.
DeAndre Hopkins, $10 million a year.
That one makes it tough for me, man, because it's like he produced at a similar level to Jalen Tolbert. Now, it was with 2 teams last year. I understand, and that's a different thing. I would probably say no.
Okay. Marquise Brown, 2 years, $18 million.
That one's more interesting, but I wonder about the fit with the kind of offense the Cowboys are doing. So I would say yes, but with an asterisk.
Darius Slayton, 3 years at like $12.5 million a year.
Darius Slayton's interesting to me. I think I would say yes. Yeah.
Or you could bring back somebody like Brandon Cooks. PFF has Brandon Cooks projected 1 year, $3 million per year.
I mean, I don't have a problem with bringing back Brandon Cooks. I think he's a great locker room guy, and I think he can give you some stuff. But I honestly think that if you bring back Brandon Cooks, you're probably not done shopping yet. I mean,
I would bring Brandon Cooks back at that price. There's no downside there.
Yeah,
all right, so let's go to defensive tackles, because that's another position that you mentioned. Calais Campbell's 1 year, $3 million. Jerron Reed, 1 year, $6 million. Poona Ford, 1 year, $3 million.
That's the one to me, like the Poona Ford guy. Yeah, especially if you could get Osa, you re-sign Osa, bring Poona Ford in. Like, kind of have him sign him to a 2-year deal. He's 31 years old, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah.
He's probably looking for like a nice kind of finishing contract. Duke was an elite run defender last year. Get him in here and just pump him in the middle for the first and second down and take him off and let one of your defensive ends reduce and rush the passer on third downs. I think you would get great benefits out of this. He'd help you set up an opportunity to rush the passer on third down. It'll be a good compliment versus what you've got if you were to re-sign Osa as well.
I think edge rusher is another position that they could go after. Now, the hard part is like Khalil Mack is projected 2 years, $40 million. I think that's probably out of their price range. Probably.
Yeah, I mean, look, I also don't want to I'm also of the mind that I don't want to spend huge money at defensive end when I could go get one in the draft. I've got 2 guys that I like already, and you're going to be paying Micah Parsons more money than God. So, I think it makes some sense to either draft a guy or get a cheap veteran to kind of throw into the mix with the young guys that you've already got.
So if it's not wide receiver, if it's not defensive end or defensive tackle, where you're not spending, let's say, $13-14 million a year, like they've targeted that much money for that, or they've budgeted that much money for one player, I'm not sure what it is then.
Yeah, I mean, it could be maybe you bring in a corner, right? Maybe you bring in a guy like to kind of be a shortstop gap stop solution for the time period that you're not going to have Diggs early in the season potentially, or if you don't expect him to kind of be back at 100% right away. Maybe we have not heard anything really about safety. And I know you have 2 guys that you have under contract, but I do feel like it's a position in which if you could get some a cheap, upgrade there, I mean, look, the safety market in general seems to be rather depressed, which means that you could go get a Javon Holland for a lot cheaper than you probably would normally in the market. So if you wanted to upgrade the position and you're looking to kind of, spend a little bit of money on a guy, I think safety could be a position. Maybe you don't get huge bang for your buck impact wise, but I think you will get very good bang for your buck dollar versus value wise, just because safety is such a depressed market.
Let me give you one more before we move on. What about interior offensive line? Now,
Yeah,
they have Tyler Smith, who they should pay this offseason. I don't know if they will. We heard some more rumblings about maybe Cooper Beebe moving over to guard. We'll see about that. But could they be in the market for somebody like Tevin Jenkins, who is a big, powerful guard, only 27? He's dealt with some injuries, but somebody like that, or maybe you even go out and get a Mekhi Becton and give him a big contract if you really want to be more physical on the offensive line. What are your thoughts?
Or I like those guys. Or if you are thinking about moving BB back out to guard, there was kind of some talk about that in an interview with Cooper Riley. Cooper Riley or Connor Riley?
Connor Riley.
Yeah. So maybe you look at some of the centers. There's some decent centers in this market. I'm pretty sure Ryan Kelly's available.
Ryan Kelly's an option.
Dalman from the Falcons, who is really, really good as well. So there are some guys, like if you wanted to kind of get in an experienced center to kind of be a stabilizing force, especially since you've lost Zach Martin. Right now, Terrence Steele is the most veteran offensive lineman you've got. So if you wanted to bring in a veteran center who could kind of set the tone for an offensive line room that's missing its veteran Hall of Famer, I think that makes a lot of sense as well.
Yeah, I agree. Let's talk about some other little notes from Stephen Jones and from the David Moore piece. We will get to that next. Welcome back to the Locked On Cowboys podcast. We'd like to thank you for making us your first listen every single day. For your second listen, check out the Locked On NFL Draft Show with Damian Parson and Keith Sanchez. Now that the season is over, get the latest draft rankings, rumors, and news every single day. Find Locked On NFL Draft on YouTube or wherever you listen to your podcasts. So in that David Moore piece, Landon, they mentioned that the Cowboys want to draft a quarterback this year. What an awful draft to need a quarterback, but they want to draft a quarterback. I'm going to assume late day 2, early day 3. Does that kind of signal the end of the Trey Lance experience in Dallas?
Oh yeah, I would think so, right? I mean, they don't have any ties to him anymore. I mean, the coach that probably wanted him is no longer here. The contract is obviously up. He's unrestricted free agent. There's no other money involved there. yeah, I mean, they seem to kind of indicate too when they were talked about it that they did give the Tony Pollard and Tyron
They
Smith
did.
kind of a speech about Trey Lance when they asked about him. So
We love
yeah,
everything he's done. He's been a great player he's worked really hard. We
great locker room
appreciate that.
guy.
We
Yeah.
appreciate everything that Trey's done for us.
That's right. Yeah. So they gave him the Viking funeral as they sent him off
Yeah.
on
Yeah.
his with his shield. So yeah, I do think that they are likely to kind of move on and I even think that they, if I'm not mistaken, Steven discussed the how Cooper may be prohibitively expensive this year as a backup. So and
I
if they
doubt
want to
it,
spend
but
the area,
go ahead.
yeah, I know, right? Well, I mean, especially with Mike McCarthy not having a job, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, maybe he ends up with New Orleans, but I don't know, right? So I think at this point they are planning on bringing in a young guy to be the backup quarterback, or at least drafting a young guy and then maybe another veteran. Who knows, depending on how that all works out.
I don't want to spend too much time on this, but what type of quarterback do you think they would draft on day
Well, that's
3?
what's interesting. That's what's interesting, right? To me, I do think that it's time to start thinking about looking at more mobile quarterbacks, right? Like you've got an offensive coordinator in here who obviously has a history with that a little bit with Kyler Murray and involving that in his run game. You don't necessarily need to be leaning into Jalen Milroe.
No.
It doesn't need to be a guy that is you're drafting solely on his ball carrier traits, right? Talent. But I do think that having a guy that brings that element to your offense is something that more and more of these modern offenses are trying to do, right?
I just don't know who that is in this draft. Like, I think Milroe's probably going to go on day 2. I mean, are you looking at like? I even think like Tyler Shuck from Louisville has a little bit of athleticism, but are you drafting a 26-year-old quarterback to be a backup to Dak? Probably not. That's why I just think it's really interesting in this class, because the guys that could be options for them, like the Will Howards, the Riley Leonards, the Kyler McCords, like, are fine day 3 quarterbacks, but they're all backup quarterbacks in the NFL.
Dylan, what's
Dylan
his
Gabriel
name?
from see, that one's interesting, but he's 5'10". So
yeah. I mean, they all got warts. This is a terrible year to draft a quarterback, right? But like, I mean, I think that that's why they probably wouldn't do it until a little bit later, or they would get a truly developmental guy, and then maybe like maybe they ride with Will Grier as the backup, as the actual backup quarterback going into the season while they develop a younger guy. So who knows? It's gonna be interesting to see exactly what kind of quarterbacks they look at.
Another note from Stephen Jones is that they're not moving on from Terrence Steele. Somebody asked him if Terrence Steele is going to play guard, right tackle. He said right tackle. They think that this scheme is going to be better for him. I know there were a lot of people thinking that Terrence Steele could be maybe a cap casualty this offseason. Doesn't seem like that's going to be the case at all.
No, and they seem to be under the impression that they think that Clayton Adams can really kind of get a lot out of him, and I don't disagree necessarily, because one of the things that Terrence Steele really did extremely well was down block, right? And when you're doing a lot of this kind of counter stuff, like him getting the opportunity to down block on a defensive tackle more often than he had been doing the last few years, I think is going to be beneficial to him. I think with more run game stuff, Terrence Steele is a very good run blocking right tackle. I'm not necessarily the reason we have discussed, potential for cuts with Terrence Steele is because of the money situation, and because you just never know how these guys fit with these new coaches. But the fact that they came out with such a strong endorsement, to me, implies that Clayton Adams knows that he can get something out of Terrence Steele. And that doesn't surprise me necessarily, because we've seen it with him at different points. I just wonder if him and what the techniques that Solari was teaching just weren't necessarily a good match last group.
And he's further removed from his injury. One of the things we've seen from Terrence Steele is in each of the last 2 seasons, he's been significantly better in the second half of the year. I don't know if it's a conditioning thing or if it's a trust in his knee, but I'm curious to see what it looks like in 2025 with the new offensive line coach and maybe an offense that is better suited to his skill set. One other thing that I wanted to ask you about is they talked about DeMarcus Lawrence and whether or not the Cowboys are going to resign him. And basically, to me, it sounded like they're kind of pushing the can down a little bit, saying, hey, we'll talk with DeMarcus Lawrence, but it's kind of up to him whether he wants to continue to play. What do you think's going on here?
Yeah, I mean, honestly, my heart sank a little bit because when I read it, to me, it read like they know he's going to announce retirement and that they're just kind of hedging for that. But maybe I read that wrong. Who knows?
No, that was my initial read as well.
So yeah, I mean, I think that there's obviously the chance that D-Law hangs it up. I mean, it certainly is at that period, right? He's kind of extended the last few years of his career by playing more of a kind of a rotational role, but obviously a starter rotational role, right? And then obviously last year, kind of getting hit with the injury bug again after being avoided that for sort of several years previous to that. It does feel like if he wanted to hang it up, it would be an appropriate time just because of all the things that I just mentioned.
Mm-hmm.
However, I do think that the Cowboys still owe him a little bit of dead money. I think it's $7 million or something left on this contract. If he wanted to come back, for a nice team-friendly deal and be part of a healthy rotation, I do think that he is a guy that can still give you really, really valuable snaps, especially as a run defender, and then can also reduce down and be a pass rusher inside as well. So if he wants to come back, I'm very much on board with signing him, to a reasonable deal, which I'm assuming he would want, and having him back. Otherwise, I could totally see him just saying, "Hey, that's enough. I've fought through this so many times. I don't know if I want to do that one more time. I'm going to call it quits."
I also wonder if DeMarcus Lawrence hasn't made that decision yet, and maybe he's not planning on making it anytime soon. Remember, he suffered a season-ending foot injury in, was it week 4, I believe, against the Giants. Maybe he's not fully healthy yet. I guess I just won't be surprised with Tank if we just don't hear anything until July or August. Yeah. Maybe once we get a little bit closer to the season, if he's feeling better, maybe that's when some of this will pick back up. But to me, it just sounded like, hey, a decision's not coming anytime soon. So just be ready for that.
I mean, I don't imagine that he's part of the free agent market, I don't think he's going to be going to take visits at other teams and all that stuff. No. It's likely either he's going to play for the Cowboys a year or two more, or he's retiring. Right. Yeah. So at this point, that means that he's not on any timeline. He's not in any rush to kind of give an answer.
I'm sure the Cowboys would love to have him back. It's just finding the right amount of money and figuring out whether he wants to play or not.
Yeah. So that means that he's just not really part of this, first wave of free agency because he's not on that same timeline. He's got two options. He's coming back with the Cowboys or he's retiring. I just don't see him going someplace else.
All right, that is it for today's show. We want to thank you for making Locked On Cowboys your first listen every single day. Make sure you check out the channel on YouTube. We are free and available on all platforms. Follow Landon on Twitter @McCoolBCB. I'm @Marcus_Mosier, and we will see you right back here tomorrow.